Hey everybody, Stacy here with Pitch Deck Fire, and I'm so glad you've joined us for our pitch hack of the week this week. If you haven't been with us before, we cover tips and tricks on pitching, pitch decks, sales decks, investor decks, and live presentations. So if you are a startup looking for funding or an established company looking for new customers, maybe you're even in an accelerator or an incubator program, all of you can find value in our pitch hacks here. So let's hop right into it. What's this week's pitch hack of the week? Pitch hack of the week this week is, what is an FFF round? So in the startup community, you may have heard the term FFF round thrown around, and perhaps you weren't quite sure what it is. If you haven't done a Google search yet, you may not know. So if you don't know, an FFF round stands for friends, family, and fools. And it's just a joke with the fools. What it's referring to is people who invest in a company very, very early stage before there's any information about whether it's going to be successful. And that's exactly what an FFF round is. It's one of the earliest stages of funding that many startups receive. In the startup community, there's lots of different rounds of funding, and they all have different names. Back in the day, it used to be a little bit more consistent. There was certain names for rounds, and everyone kind of prescribed to those names. Nowadays, there's a lot of different rounds, and not all companies go with the same naming structure, and the round names don't really mean as much. But in the general, the FFF round is referring to one of the very first or the very first round of funding that a startup gets. And it's because when you're very, very early stage, what you're doing is you're leaning a lot on your personal relationships with people to be able to get funding. You haven't seen success. You haven't built an MVP, a minimum viable product. You haven't gotten anywhere with your company yet. You have nothing to point to say, we're going to be successful. Don't worry. There's a return in this investment. Instead, you're kind of saying, here's my concept. It's really good. The opportunity is big. I think I know what I'm doing. Invest in me and I'll make this happen. So it tends to be the case that the FFF round is one of the very first rounds that a startup will receive. Not every company does an FFF round. In fact, not every company gets funding at all, right? There's a lot of startup companies that are perfectly successful just doing things organically and growing their company organically, and that is totally fine. There's a ton of information out there about funding, and startups talk a lot about funding because a lot of company structures that are called startup have a lot of upfront costs. And when you have a lot of upfront costs, that's a lot to get over before you actually end up making money, which can be really hard for many companies to succeed with unless they have some base of funding to go off of. So unless you're digging into some giant savings account that you have, you generally are raising funds from somebody else when you need that kind of upfront capital. And when you raise it from friends and family early stages, it usually is called the FFF round. And it's not for everybody, right? There's some pros and cons to getting money from Uncle Frank. I have an interesting article on our blog that has some more information about that, pros and cons of the FFF round. But in general, early stage rounds are very, very valuable for companies who really need that money up front to be able to get to the next stages or to be able to try to grow their company organically from that point forward. When you do an FFF round, consider not letting too many people into your rounds though, because as your company gets bigger and you add more and more investors to the pile, it's going to look less and less good to have a lot of people on that list. Generally speaking, I would say talk to your lawyer about anything I talk about when it comes to raising funds and those sorts of things. So hopefully that answered your question for what is an FFF round this week. Thanks for joining for our pitch hack of the week this week. We have new pitch hacks every single week, so I hope you join us again soon. If you have any thoughts on the FFF round or other types of rounds, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Also, there's a link down there if you have new ideas for pitch hacks. I would love to hear them and answer some of your questions in upcoming weeks. Happy pitching!